This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for tuning in this week's NC Spin. Two big announcements dominated the news this week, and we want to talk about the school openings and whether to relax restrictions on businesses. We also look at legal matters, including how much authority the governor has during emergencies. And if there's time, we'll discuss hospital mergers. But of course, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of which, this week's panel includes Bob Orr, former Supreme Court Justice, Chris Fitzsimon, director of the state's Newsroom, the Beau Brummel of NC Spin, Rick Henderson, the editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal with his matching bow tie and mask, and Rufus Edmisten, former Secretary of State and former Attorney General, who just celebrated last week his 21st birthday. Happy birthday, Rufus.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll begin our uninterrupted discussions after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Let's begin the spin. President Harry Truman once quipped that if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. I suspect Governor Roy Cooper understands how he felt after making two big announcements this week. The first dealt with how schools can open in August. The second talked about whether or not to relax restrictions on businesses. Rufus, the governor, postponed his announcement because he was trying to get consensus from people about whether to go in class or a modified plan or all online. He finally made the announcement for Plan B, which is sort of a modified plan. What was your response to his announcement?
I thought of Heinz 57 soup. There's a little bit in there for everybody. And you're going to please no one entirely with this because it's extremely complicated. And I've talked to a lot of teachers, and many of them are very weary of going back to class. I think it's a herd mentality. And I don't know exactly how this is all going to work out with the different conflicting statutes, different conflicting classes, but he's doing the best he can, and I think it is a well-reasoned, doing the best you can, being governor of North Carolina.
Rick, this announcement affects traditional schools and charter schools, but doesn't affect private schools. They can make their own decisions about this. The only real mandate out of it was that we weren't going to go back to all in-class instruction. He gave these local school systems a lot of flexibility, didn't he?
Well, no, really he didn't, because the one area that he didn't give flexibility that I think would have been very helpful is to have provided the ability for students in the early grades, K3 or K5, to have some more in-person instruction, if not full-time in-person instruction, because that's one of the few areas that people involved in the study of child psychology, pediatrics, and education all agree, is that young students benefit the most from having direct contacts with the teacher unless their family is consciously homeschooling. And this is going to be extremely disruptive, and that's unfortunate because it's also seems to be the case from what we know that COVID-19 isn't transmitted as readily or as easily from small children to adults and vice versa. And so this was the one area that I think there should have been more flexibility. And I think what's going to happen, unfortunately, is that we just basically have 2 years, academic years of education in North Carolina that's lost, that's just written off completely.
I'm not sure everybody agrees with that opinion, Rick. Bob Orr, there were loud pronouncements about this, particularly from the Republican side of the fence. They were critical because they wanted to return back to full-time in-class instruction. Has this issue become so politicized that regardless of what Cooper announced, it was not going to be popular?
Well, I think it's about 50% public health driven and about 50% politically driven, which is unfortunate. If we are, as I think we'd all agree, in this extraordinary public health emergency, there is no simple answer. There is no solution to the public education dilemma. And I mean, I feel for Governor Cooper, but what troubles me, and we'll talk about this later in the show, is the sort of the unilateral ability of the governor to make this decision. Where was the State Board of Education? Where was the Superintendent of Public Instruction? The General Assembly wants to weigh in on it. We need a consensus on something that critical.
Well, that was the problem. He couldn't get consensus. That's why he delayed this for a week. And I do know he was talking with educators. He was talking with parents. He was talking with legislators. He was talking with all kinds of people trying to get some sort of an opinion. Chris, the one thing that there does seem to be pretty good opinion about, a Quinnipiac poll was released earlier this week that says by a 2-to-1 margin, people do not believe it is safe to send their kids back to school. In Wake County, 20% of the parents have already opted out for online learning instead of Plan B or anything else. What does that tell you?
Well, I think it tells you that there's a significant part of our political infrastructure or institutions that doesn't realize how worried the average person in North Carolina, the average parent, the average worker, the average family, how worried they are about this coronavirus. I also think it's interesting that school systems now increasingly are choosing option C. They're not going to Plan B. When Governor Cooper gave them the option, they're going to Plan C, which is less, at least initially, more online learning, less in-person learning. You know, a lot was made, and even John wrote an editorial, John Hood, about the American Academy of Pediatrics initial report about how important it was, and we all agree with that. Also, the Academy then followed up and said, but in states with high incidences of coronavirus, the school should listen to local health officials and listen to the science. I thought there was a New York Times column recently that said, when you mix science and politics, you get politics. And so I think we need to be careful. We need to do the best we can, keep the schools open the schools the best we can. But, you know, we have more than 1,100 people in North Carolina in the hospital now, an all-time high. It's not going down.
Rufus, I want you to comment on two parts of this question. The first is, under Plan B, what we're going to end up with is kids are in class some days and not other days. Working parents are complaining about this creates all kinds of child care issues for them. And I'm not very good at math. As has been demonstrated for a long time, but it looks to me like under Plan B, we're going to need a whole lot more teachers than what we've got right now, and we've already got a teacher shortage, right?
Well, absolutely. I was mentioning a moment ago, I don't know how you square up all these things, because you got kids coming into school one day who's doing the in-person learning, then you've got teachers switching over to do the online learning. I'm an old former third grade teacher, and I can't imagine either a bunch of third graders doing socially distancing
and keeping masks on.
Yeah. I don't quite see how all this meshes together. It's going to take a magician to make it all work.
Rick, part of the reasoning for having children in class is that the data had suggested that young children don't get the coronavirus they're not as susceptible as most adults are, and furthermore, it's not as severe when they get it, and they are not more likely to spread it. But this past week, several days ago, the state of Florida just issued a press release saying that of the children they are testing, 31%, or 1/3 of them, are actually testing the children, or testing positive for coronavirus. Is that a game changer?
Well, we know the virus is mutating, and so that's why I think we're eventually going to wind up going entirely Plan C statewide, simply because it's going to be, as Rufus said, very, very difficult to find enough teachers to handle things in the classroom, and we may well find out that children are more susceptible to becoming positive than we thought initially. But the thing about teachers is that a lot of teachers who are close to retirement age are going to retire. A lot of teachers who are over 65 are going to retire. It's going to be very, very difficult to staff classrooms, and so that's why I think we're going to Plan C entirely, and I still don't think we're ready for it.
lots of details about this, Bob, that still aren't nailed down, even as Cooper and Secretary Cohen have tried their very best to come up with protocols and so forth. There's a lot that hasn't been nailed down. If we have a more severe outbreak of the coronavirus, do you think we might end up back where we were in March, where everybody's got to go online?
Well, you look at states like Florida and Texas that are starting to move backwards from their original plans on reopening. I think it's certainly conceivable. I think we still, in a large percentage of the population here in North Carolina, really aren't taking it as seriously as we need to. I picked up a to-go pizza last night with my mask on, and there were 30 people in the restaurant drinking and eating, and there wasn't a mask in sight. I think there's a real danger of it.
Well, I have not been able to master the art of being able to drink and eat with my mask on. I will say that part. Chris, Governor Cooper announced that we were going to remain in phase 2 for 3 more weeks. That announcement almost just got lost. Everybody was so busy paying attention to the announcement about schools. Not much reaction on that. Have you heard a whole lot of reaction about it?
No, I think people realized that it was unlikely we were going to move forward because our cases have been going up, our hospitalizations have been going up, and states around the country are backing up, as Bob pointed out. It's really frustrating to watch this become a political issue when have polls show that the vast majority of Democrats are wearing masks. About half Republicans don't believe you should. We have a lieutenant governor who questions the validity and the efficacy and the point of wearing a mask. He's literally the leading elected Republican in North Carolina. There's so many mixed political messages. I think that is accounting for a lot of our problems. I wish all of our leaders could stand together at a podium wearing masks and say, for goodness sakes, let's disagree about all kinds of issues, but let's protect each other.
They're political issues, but there are also some legal matters involved in this. Several big legal issues facing North Carolina. I deliberately planned this panel to have 2 experienced lawyers. Perhaps the most pressing legal issue regards how much authority does a governor have during times of emergency. So let's start there. Bob Orr, the question is hand as whether the governor, as chief executive officer of the state government, has the authority to make decisions or is required to consult with and get concurrence from the Council of State. You've examined our statutes, I know, because you sent them to me. Tell us how you read the answer to this question.
Well, the 2012 modernization of the Emergency Management Act gave the governor sweeping powers in an emergency. And the governor has the authority to declare the emergency. He has the authority to say the emergency is no longer in place. It's written in a very general way. I think Governor Cooper has taken full advantage in exercising powers over it. But there is a specific provision that talks about additional authorities, which I think arguably encompasses the closing of businesses. And that does call for concurrence with the Council of State. At this point, there's no definitive answer. But frankly, in my opinion, the act needs to be rewritten and reconsidered.
I want to talk about that a little bit. There are 2 big issues involved with this, Rick, as far as I'm concerned. The first is that this statute gives, as Bob says, broad powers to the governor under the Emergency Management Act. But it never envisioned an emergency that was going to last months. It was typically thought about from a standpoint that we had a hurricane and for a couple of weeks we had power outages and things of that nature. Mostly just those kinds of events. Should there be a time limit put in this Emergency Management Act?
Well, for some aspects, there are time limits in the Emergency Management Act, and that's part of the legal challenge Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest has put before the governor, is talking about things dealing with actual quarantine orders and things dealing with public health. The statute says that the state health director is the person responsible for doing that, and the Lieutenant Governor says the governor is acting as the state health director in this case, and those orders can only be in effect for 30 days without the approval of the General Assembly or the Council of State. I forget which one it is, but it at least needs concurrence from some outside authority beside the person making that decision. And basically all we've heard on these sorts of challenges is that the governor has said, well, I've asked the Attorney General, and he said it was okay. But that doesn't really seem to be sufficient in such a serious situation.
Rufus, the second part of this that seems to be causing so many people trouble is this codicil that Bob Orr talked about needing to consult with and get concurrence from the Council of State. But here again, this statute never envisioned that we were going to have a highly partisan political Council of State to deal with. Should that be changed?
Well, you know, Tom, you sat at the Council of State for years like I did through hundreds of meetings, and we dealt with hurricanes and removing weight limits and routine mundane things like that. I think that when the people drew up the emergency management statute, they weren't thinking about what you just mentioned a moment ago.
Of course not, yeah.
And although it would be stupid, though, or inconsistent to say that you have a cutoff date, and with the partisan bickering that we have right now, you gotta have a strong leadership. Now, back in my day when I was Attorney General, we were talking about legislative incursions on the separation of powers. Today, it's all about the so-called incursion of the executive branch into powers that they should not have, according to the lawsuit filed by the Lieutenant Governor. So what we're seeing is a twist and turn of the separation of powers, and I'd have to go with the governor in sweeping powers because we've never seen anything like this before, and you can't stop in the middle of a pandemic like this and say, okay, let's have a vote on the Council of State.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
Yeah. So far as it goes, Chris, both PPP and Civitas have taken polls on this recently. Both of them show about 53% of the public of North Carolina approves of the way Governor Cooper is managing this pandemic. Is this going to be a referendum, the gubernatorial election, ultimately going to be a referendum on his management?
I think a lot of it will. I do think that people in general are satisfied with the way the governor is managing this crisis, and I think it stands in stark contrast to the fact that nobody in Washington is managing it at all. And I think the national referendum is a referendum on President Trump's abdication of leadership, really, and all the governors are far more popular. I will say I do think we need a long, thoughtful look at the Emergency Powers Act when we're not in the middle of an emergency. We should remember these lessons. I think we need some sort of bipartisan look at this when we're finally back to some semblance of normalcy.
The key word there is bipartisan. Rick, what changes would you suggest to the Emergency Management Act?
I'm not really sure that any changes need to be made. I think it just simply needs to be enforced. I think that this debate came up earlier when there was the question about whether the Council of State needed to concur and should they pass a new act or should the Council of State sue. And several GOP attorneys said, "What are we going to do? Pass a law that says this time we really mean it?" I mean, I think that
we mean it this time.
If the enforcement of the law, on the books goes forward, I think you would see some need for at least consultation, if not concurrence.
Let me shift gears just a little bit, Bob Orr. This group reopened North Carolina this past week, went over to the legislature and suggested that they wanted legislation introduced to impeach the governor. Well, I think most people just ruled it out of hand and dismissed the idea. But let's talk about that a little bit. North Carolina has only had in its history one impeachment of a governor. That was William Holden, and it was over the North Carolina Railroad many years ago, as a matter of fact. But what do you consider to be legitimate reasons for impeachment proceedings?
Well, Governor Cooper attempting to exercise these general powers of an emergency situation certainly does not constitute grounds for impeachment. I think if there are any problems, the problems are with the statute. And so there's nothing that Governor Cooper has done, even though I think there are things he's done correctly and things he's done incorrectly. One of them's letting the bar exam go forward.
You wrote about that, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm going to talk about that eventually, but but there's certainly nothing that he's done. I mean, it's all essentially in good faith effort to try and deal with the competing interest in this pandemic.
Rufus, we talked about whether this would impact the elections or not. We've already seen a large number of people who are requesting absentee ballots to be able to vote absentee in the November 3rd elections. Now, we had a big scandal in 2016 in the 9th Congressional District. The laws have been changed a little bit so that if you get an absentee ballot, you only have to have one witness to sign it, whereas before we had to have two. Was this a good change?
It's a very good change. The whole concept of voting, as envisioned by our founding fathers, was to let people vote that are eligible. Now, when you put obstacles up like having two people, and it used to be you had to have a notary public. I remember way back there for an absentee ballot, which was ridiculous. And now you have 4 out of 10 people are opting for absentee ballots, and we should make it easier. And in fact, I believe that I think there's a lawsuit pending, if I'm correct, Bob, where someone is saying that the state ought to prepay the postage for people. I think would be a great idea. We ought to make it easier for people to vote.
Chris, there have been some suggestions and some accusations, as a matter of fact, that having two witnesses was an act of voter suppression. We've heard a lot of conversation about voter suppression in North Carolina. How big a problem is that?
Well, it's a big enough problem that we had a bipartisan consensus in the General Assembly to do away with it. We were only one of a handful of states that required that. I think you're going to see increasing use of that this year. Obviously, with people are really worried if the case load and the hospitalizations are still going, and as we get towards the election, I think you're going to see a dramatic increase. People want to vote. They want to vote safely.
Rick, we have so many court cases. It seems like every time somebody passes a piece of legislation or takes an action, there's a court case. Have the courts sort of become a de facto legislator or legislating from the bench, so to speak? Are there too many instances where politics are involved in this? Does it make sense for us to continue to elect judges and have them elected partisan-wise, having to declare Democrat or Republican? Are the courts too involved in all this?
Well, the courts are very involved in this situation, and probably more than they should be, but I think that's largely an issue of the membership of the courts themselves. You do see venue shopping taking place, which is unfortunate. You do see the situation in which, for instance, in the recent case involving the bowling alley owners, one judge says they should be allowed to reopen.
Supreme Court says something else.
Supreme Court says something immediately.
So
that is an issue, but again, this is a big deal. This is a big deal.
We need to move on here a little bit. I've got one other question. We've had, and I want to get this very quickly because we're about 3 minutes left in show. I'm going to go around the panel, and I want a very quick answer. We had 2 executions in America this week. We haven't had one since 2006 in North Carolina. Is it time to do away with the death penalty in North Carolina, Rufus?
Yes.
All right. Bob Orr.
Yeah, it probably is.
All right, Chris.
Yes, it is past time. It is. It's ridiculous.
Rick.
Almost certainly, but there may be exceptions.
All right. Let's move to the part of the show where we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon, I'm going to start with you.
Late this week, there was a report from the Center for Public Integrity in Washington that said 18 states in America, this is a secret report prepared for the White House, for the Trump administration, by folks in the White House, 18 states that are at risk of having to go backwards in their reopening plans. North Carolina is one of them.
Wow. Rufus, tell us something we don't know.
I predict that over 50% of the voters this time in North Carolina will vote by mail.
Interesting. 50%. Bob Orr, tell us something we don't know.
Well, nobody really cares about the bar exam, but the governor's executive order prohibits mass gatherings, and yet the Board of Law Examiners is cramming hundreds of applicants for the bar into a 2-day, 6-hour-a-day testing facility and proceeding under the so-called exception that they're a governmental operation.
Well,
It's
let me ask you a question. How should that be done? I'm a third-year graduate of a law school. This is the most important test I'll ever take in my life. How should this bar exam be conducted this year?
Yeah, it should be an online exam, and other states are doing it.
Isn't that the same thing as an open book exam?
No. There are all sorts of protections and safeguards that other states are using.
Rick Henderson, I got about a minute left. Tell me something I don't know.
I agree with Rufus that the percentage of absentee or vote by mail ballots cast this time is going to be very high. Voting in early voting places is going to be extremely problematic if social distancing guidelines are in place, and so it's not going to be a fun election cycle this time for the poll workers.
I can agree with that. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To receive our free weekly email newsletter spin cycle, go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up, and subscribe to our podcast and video streams that you may have missed. Join us next week when we have more balanced debate for the old North State. Until that time, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.